Welcome to our channel. This is where we dive into the depths of mysterious stories, revealing the secrets of crimes and strange tales that many have not heard of. We are here to travel with you through a world of excitement and suspense, with exciting narration and wonderful visual presentations, all with a touch of humor that adds a special flavor to our content. Get ready for a journey full of mystery and excitement, where each video brings you a new and unforgettable experience. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to be the first to know everything new. Now let us begin our journey into the depths of mystery, where a new story awaits you, full of excitement and suspense. Prepare to discover secrets that only a few know, as it is time to dive into the events of this unparalleled tale. My name is Sami, and journalism has always been more than just a profession for me. It's a passion that consumes me, a pursuit of truth in every corner, behind every word, in every story. I have always been drawn to strange stories, the ones that defy logic and open up endless questions in my mind. I was always on the lookout for stories that went beyond the ordinary, those that seemed impossible to explain, and those stories that straddle the line between reality and fantasy. I saw them as an opportunity to uncover the unknown. A few months ago, I came across a small article in an old newspaper, buried among pages filled with mundane news that no one paid attention to. But for me, this article was the key to unlocking an unknown world. It was about the city of Mirabel, a city that vanished overnight without a trace. The article wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but the words it contained were mysterious and captivating. The city of Mirabel disappeared 50 years ago, without explanation. Its people, buildings, and every trace of its existence vanished. No one knows why, and no one survived to tell the story. For me, those words weren't just about a lost city. There was something bigger here, something waiting to be uncovered. I knew there was more to this than just a missing city, and I was determined to find out what it was. I started researching intensively, but information was scarce. Most of what I found was vague references and old rumors. Even modern articles tried to tie the event to supernatural occurrences and popular legends, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more scientific at play here, something explainable. I reached out to several people who might know something about the city, but each one either brushed me off or avoided the subject altogether. There was one elderly man I spoke to in a nearby town, and when I mentioned Mirabel, he gave me a fearful look and said in a hushed voice, "Don't go looking for Mirabel. There are places no one should venture into. It'll bring you trouble, son." That's when I knew there was more to this than people were willing to admit. It wasn't just a city that disappeared. There was fear, something people weren't ready to confront. And yet, the more they warned me, the stronger my desire grew to understand what happened. I dug through old archives handling ancient newspapers, some of which were covered in layers of dust. I carefully combed through each page, searching for any clue, any shred of information that might help me make sense of it all. Over time, I started to piece things together, and I came to a shocking realization. In every article and piece of writing about the city, one thing was always mentioned: a mysterious man who appeared in the city the night before it vanished. This man, according to old reports, seemed normal at first. He wore a long coat and carried an old pocket watch. He didn't raise any suspicion initially, but over time, some of the residents began to grow uneasy. He would speak to everyone as though he knew them personally. He visited every house in the town, having long conversations with the people. Although he looked strange, some started to suspect he wasn't just a wanderer, but rather someone or something far more mysterious. The more I read about this man, the more I felt like I was stumbling into something much bigger. There was something not right about this story. I knew I had to know more. This wasn't just a story about a lost city. It was something far more unsettling. The more I uncovered, the more I realized I was diving into a mystery that couldn't be explained by ordinary means. As I continued my research, I started to feel as though the story was pulling me in. There was something waiting for me, something that was going to change everything. One morning, I made a decision. I had to go there. I couldn't sit back and let this mystery slip away. I needed to see it for myself. I gathered my things, my bag, my camera, my recording equipment, ready to embark on what I knew would not be an ordinary journey. There was something out there, something waiting for me in that lost city, and I was going to find it. Despite warnings from many that the place was too remote and hard to reach, I couldn't be deterred. The more they warned me, the more I felt the pull to go. Something in my gut told me that this was bigger than just a journalistic investigation. I was about to uncover one of the greatest mysteries of my life. I packed my car and began the journey. I didn't know what would happen along the way, but I knew one thing. I was on the brink of discovering something monumental, something that had been hidden for decades. The drive felt endless, and the more I traveled, the more isolated I became. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the wilds of the mountains, where civilization seemed to fade into a distant memory. The landscape around me became increasingly desolate, with only the occasional sign of life, a bird flying overhead or the rustle of leaves in the wind, to remind me that the world I knew still existed somewhere far behind me. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the narrow, winding road ahead. I had been driving for hours, my car bouncing over the rough terrain, and I could feel my grip on the wheel tightening as I navigated the increasingly treacherous path. The air was thick with tension, and I could almost taste the feeling of mystery hanging in the atmosphere, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. Every turn seemed to bring me closer to the unknown. I knew I was getting closer to Mirabel. My research had shown that the town was located in a remote valley, tucked away between high cliffs, far from any major road or city. No one had been able to explain exactly how the residents lived their lives without any modern conveniences. But the people who once inhabited the city spoke of a peaceful, simple life, unaffected by the hustle and bustle of the outside world. As I approached the final stretch of my journey, the road narrowed even further, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The trees on either side of the road grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as though they had witnessed centuries of secrets. I felt like I was entering a different world, one that had been forgotten by time. I drove for what felt like hours, until the sky above was a deep shade of purple, the last remnants of sunlight slowly slipping away behind the mountains. The road became almost impossible to navigate, and I could barely make out the path ahead through the thickening fog. The eerie quiet of the place seemed to amplify every sound, the hum of the engine, the occasional creak of the car's suspension, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals that echoed in the stillness. Suddenly, as if the landscape had shifted beneath me, I saw something in the distance, a faint glow, a light that flickered from behind a veil of fog. I slowed the car, unsure of what I was seeing. My heart began to race, and I felt an odd sense of dread wash over me. But I couldn't turn back now. I had come too far. As I inched closer, the fog thickened around me, swallowing the car in a dense cloud. I could barely see my hands on the steering wheel, let alone the road ahead. The light grew brighter until it became a flickering lantern, casting long, eerie shadows on the trees lining the road. It was almost as if the light itself was guiding me forward, urging me to continue into the unknown. I rolled down my window and the cold, damp air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of earth and pine. The world outside was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel small and insignificant. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet, the rhythmic thud like a drumbeat in the vast emptiness of the forest. The light ahead grew stronger, and I saw, to my disbelief, a small clearing up ahead. A strange old sign stood in the center of the clearing, barely visible through the fog, its words worn and faded. As I got closer, I could just make out the faint outline of the letters. Welcome to Mirabel. I stopped the car and stared at the sign, my pulse quickening. There was no mistaking it. This was it. The city of Mirabel, the place I had read about, researched and dreamt of uncovering, was right in front of me. But as I looked around, something felt off. The fog hung in the air like a heavy curtain, and the trees in the clearing seemed to stretch unnaturally tall, their shadows long and twisted. I stepped out of the car, and the cool air hit my face with a rush. The forest around me seemed strangely quiet, with no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, no distant calls of birds. Just complete, utter silence. I took a few steps forward, and my footsteps echoed unnervingly in the stillness. The ground beneath my feet was soft, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing and waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just beyond the mist. But every time I turned, I saw nothing but the endless fog and the towering trees. The clearing, once a promising sign of discovery, now felt like a trap. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car and leave before it was too late, but I couldn't bring myself to. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. I had to see it through. I walked closer to the sign, my heart pounding in my chest. It stood there, as though it had been waiting for me, ancient and weathered, yet standing proud amidst the forgotten landscape. I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers made contact, I felt a strange coldness in the air. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as though the air itself was rejecting me, pushing me back. A voice inside my head whispered, "Don't touch it. You're not ready." I froze, startled by the thought that had invaded my mind. I took a step back, unsure of what was happening. The fog seemed to grow thicker around me, and I suddenly felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. Something was wrong here, and I wasn't sure I was prepared to face it. Just then, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only more trees, more fog. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkened woods, but the silence returned, deafening. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Whether it was the land itself or something far darker, I couldn't tell. But I was no longer just a visitor. I had crossed into something else, something that I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. With a deep breath, I forced myself to take another step forward, past the sign, deeper into the heart of Mirabel. The mystery was just beginning, and now there was no turning back. The deeper I ventured into the city of Mirabel, the more it felt like I was stepping into a forgotten time, a place caught in a perpetual state of decay and silence. The once welcoming glow of the lantern had disappeared, swallowed by the thickening fog, leaving the world around me shrouded in an eerie twilight. The trees, now towering over me like ancient sentinels, seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, as if they too were watching, waiting for something. I moved cautiously, every step sinking into the soft, damp ground beneath me. The air was heavy with moisture, and it felt like I was breathing in the very essence of the forest itself, thick, musty, and unnervingly still. The city of Mirabel was hidden somewhere in this fog, but I couldn't help but feel like I was walking through a ghost town. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of life, not even the rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was as if the entire world had been muted, erased, as though time itself had frozen in place. As I moved further, I began to see the outlines of buildings emerging from the fog. They were dilapidated, their once proud structures crumbling under the weight of time. Roofs had caved in, windows were shattered, and doors hung crookedly on their hinges, like silent witnesses to a past that had long been forgotten. But what struck me most was the unsettling emptiness that surrounded these buildings. There were no signs of life, no footprints, no traces of human activity. Everything was abandoned, left behind as if the people who once lived here had simply vanished without a trace. I stopped in front of what appeared to be a large, crumbling mansion, its grand facade barely visible through the dense fog. The front door stood ajar, as though inviting me inside. A strange sense of curiosity overtook me, and despite the warning bells ringing in my mind, I stepped forward. The door creaked open with a loud groan, and I entered the darkened interior. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. Every step I took echoed in the emptiness, as if the building itself was alive, listening to my every move. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper, old furniture covered in thick layers of dust, and portraits on the walls. Faces frozen in time. The once beautiful mansion was now a shell of its former self, decaying slowly but surely. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps cautious but determined. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. But despite the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing there, But there was nothing, just the dark corners of the house and the distant echoes of my own movements. As I walked down a long corridor, I noticed something strange. One of the doors, which had been ajar, was now closed. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen anyone pass by, but there it was. A door that seemed to have shut itself, as if it had been waiting for me. Hesitant, I reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but as I stepped inside, I felt a chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The air was colder here, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I shined my flashlight around the room, and what I saw sent a cold shiver through me. There were objects scattered around the room, old books, furniture, and pictures, but it was the center of the room that caught my attention. At first I thought it was just an illusion, the way the light played off the walls, but as I moved closer, I realized that it was something far more unsettling. A figure sitting in a chair, its back to me. The figure was slumped, lifeless, and its clothes were old, ragged. Its head hung low, and I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. My heart raced, and I instinctively took a step back. But before I could react, the figure turned its head slowly, impossibly, and I was frozen in place. The face, or what I could make out of it, was pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and lifeless. It didn't speak, didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there, staring into the hollow eyes of the figure, unable to tear my gaze away. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "Leave now, or you will never leave." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to run, to get out of this cursed place. But as I turned to flee, something stopped me. The door, the one I had come through, was gone. In its place was a solid wall, a barrier that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. I slammed my fists against it, desperate to escape, but the wall remained unyielding. Panic began to take hold. I was trapped. The air around me grew heavier, colder, and the whispering voice seemed to echo in the corners of the room. It wasn't just the figure that was here. The entire house felt alive, as if it was closing in on me. "You should not have come," the voice whispered again, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift, the walls bending inward. I turned toward the window, praying to see the outside world, but all I saw was the dense fog, swirling and thickening. I wasn't in Mirabel anymore. I was in something else, a place that existed outside of time and space. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Mirabel wasn't just a city that had disappeared. It was a place that had been trapped, preserved in time, and anyone who entered would be lost, like those before me, unable to escape the grip of its dark secret. The figure in the chair, the voice in the shadows, and the eerie silence. They were all part of the same nightmare, and I was its latest victim. The air around me felt thick with an almost tangible weight, pressing down on my chest with each shallow breath I took. I could feel the walls of the room closing in, the floor beneath me shifting as if it too were alive, responding to the presence that surrounded me. The voice had faded, but its impact lingered, echoing in the silence that followed. I could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of my own heart. I backed away from the wall, my eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for any escape. The window, now blurred by the dense fog, felt like the only way out, but the realization hit me with a cold, heavy finality. The outside world was no longer within my reach. I was trapped. The figure in the chair was still there, its hollow eyes watching me with an unnerving stillness. But now it wasn't just a passive observer. There was something about its presence that seemed to stir, as though it had been waiting for me to understand. I reached into my bag, pulling out my recorder, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the buttons. I needed to document this, to capture the truth before it swallowed me whole. But when I looked at the screen, I saw nothing but static. The device flickered, the screen going blank before sputtering back to life with a garbled message. "You cannot escape. The words felt like a curse, and they shook me to my core. I was no longer in control. I could feel the weight of the city, of this place, slowly dragging me deeper into its grasp. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest. But when I looked, I saw nothing. Just the same empty room, the same shadows stretching across the floor. The crashing sound had come from somewhere beyond the room, somewhere deeper in the house. I knew that whatever it was, whatever force had been manipulating the air and the atmosphere around me, was now beginning to make itself known. The city was alive in a way that defied logic, and it was pulling me further into its dark embrace. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, to find an exit, to leave before I too became another forgotten soul trapped within the walls of this cursed place. I rushed toward the door, but just as my hand touched the handle, a voice echoed through the hallway outside. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You are not meant to be here." It wasn't the figure from the chair this time. The voice was different, more distant, as though it came from the very walls themselves. It felt ancient, timeless, as though the city itself was speaking to me, warning me to leave before it was too late. I hesitated, my hand frozen on the doorknob. I had come this far, but now the reality of what I was facing began to sink in. This wasn't just a story. This wasn't a city that had disappeared and then simply been forgotten. There was something far more sinister at play, something ancient and powerful that had lured me here, and now it wouldn't let me leave. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob, pushing the door open. The hallway beyond was dark, the walls lined with old portraits, their faces blurred with age, their eyes following me with unsettling intensity. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, as if the house itself was listening, waiting for me to make the next move. I walked down the hallway, the dim light from my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The farther I went, the colder it became, and the more oppressive the air felt. It was as though the city's very breath was hanging on my every step, each movement weighed down by an invisible force. I rounded a corner and entered a large room at the end of the hallway. The room was vast, filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets, broken chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, like forgotten relics of a bygone era. But in the center of the room, beneath a large cracked mirror, stood a small wooden table. On the table was a book, its cover worn and faded, as though it had been there for centuries, waiting for someone to open it. Without thinking, I moved toward it. My fingers shook as I reached for the book, and when I opened it, the pages were filled with strange symbols and writing I couldn't understand. Some of the pages were torn, while others were stained with what looked like dried blood. As I turned the pages, a single word stood out, scrawled in the same eerie ink that stained the rest of the book: Mirabelle. The word seemed to pulse, as if it held power, as if it were alive. And in that moment, I understood. This city, this place, wasn't just a mystery to be solved. It was a trap, a place caught in time, a place that had been erased from the world but still existed, trapped in a parallel reality. The book spoke of a curse, one that had been placed on the city long ago. It was a curse that had sealed the residents of Mirabelle in a state of eternal stasis, forcing them to live in the same moment for all eternity. They were never able to escape, never able to move forward or back. They were caught, forever frozen in the same loop. And now I had unwittingly entered that loop. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The truth was clear now. The city wasn't just lost, it was cursed, and anyone who came searching for answers would become part of its eternal cycle. The walls seemed to shift around me, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something powerful. I could feel it closing in on me. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the curse now. The city had marked me, and I couldn't escape. The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room had changed. The furniture was now positioned differently. The portraits on the walls were no longer the same. Everything had shifted, as if the house itself was rearranging its own history, trapping me within its labyrinth. I was trapped in a loop, just like the others. The figures, the voices, the whispers. They weren't just memories. They were all part of the curse, echoes of the past that would never fade. And as I turned toward the door, I realized with horror that I couldn't remember how I had entered this room in the first place. Had I come from the hallway, or had I been here all along? The truth was more horrifying than I had imagined. Mirabel wasn't just a city of the past, it was a city that never truly existed. Not in the way I had thought. It was a prison for souls, an eternal trap for those who dared to enter. And now, I was one of them. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for breath, my heart pounding as if it had been running a marathon. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but the cold sweat on my skin and the racing thoughts in my mind told me that something was terribly wrong. The room was dark, almost suffocatingly so. The air thick with an unnatural heaviness. The only sound that reached my ears was the faint, distant ticking of a clock that seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The surroundings were familiar, but not quite. The walls were still cracked, the furniture still covered in dust. But it all felt slightly different, more distorted, as if the very fabric of the space had been bent, altered in a way I couldn't understand. I reached up to rub my eyes, but when I lowered my hands, the room had shifted again. The once empty chairs now seemed to be occupied by shadowy figures, their features obscured by the dimness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Are you awake now?" a voice whispered, its tone slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. It sent a chill down my spine. I froze. The voice didn't belong to anyone in the room. It felt like it was coming from inside my head, as if the very air around me had turned into a vessel for the dark thoughts of the house itself. "I didn't think you'd make it this far," the voice continued, a faint mocking edge to it. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." I looked around in panic, trying to find the source, but the figures in the room remained still, their faces hidden in the shadows. The darkness felt alive, pulsating with an energy that was both suffocating and enticing, like it was drawing me in, pulling me toward it. I pushed myself off the floor, stumbling as my legs tried to steady themselves. My mind raced with questions. Was I dreaming? Was I hallucinating? Had the curse already begun to take its toll on my sanity? Or had I really entered some other realm, some place where time had stopped, where reality had twisted into something unrecognizable? Suddenly the door slammed open with a deafening bang, and the oppressive silence of the room was broken. A gust of cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I turned toward the door, my heart skipping a beat as I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face obscured by a hood, her posture straight and rigid. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing on my chest. There was something about her that was both familiar and alien, as though I had seen her before, or perhaps had dreamed of her. "Come with me," she whispered, her voice a soft, chilling murmur that seemed to penetrate the very air. "It's time to face the truth." I hesitated. Something about her was both comforting and terrifying. I could feel the pull of her presence, a magnetic force that seemed to draw me closer, urging me forward. I had no choice but to follow. The city of Mirabel had already ensnared me in its grasp, and there was no turning back now. I stepped forward, my legs trembling as I crossed the threshold and into the hallway. The air in the hallway was thick with fog, just as it had been when I first arrived. The walls were lined with portraits, but now the faces of the people in those portraits seemed to shift and change, their expressions twisting into grotesque, silent screams, their eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The woman moved ahead of me, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her presence ahead of me, guiding me through the labyrinth of the house. The silence was broken only by the creaking of the old floorboards beneath our feet and the occasional rustling of the fog that clung to the walls like a shroud. Finally, we reached a door at the end of the hallway, its surface dark and foreboding, as though it had never been opened in years. The woman stopped in front of it, turning to face me for the first time. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes dark and hollow, as though she had been staring into the abyss for far too long. "This is where it all began," she said softly, her voice trembling with a strange sorrow. "This is where the city was born, and where it died." Without waiting for a response, she pushed open the door, and a rush of cold air flooded the hallway. The room beyond was vast, its walls lined with shelves upon shelves of books, old tomes with cracked leather covers and yellowed pages. But in the center of the room, a large, ancient mirror stood, its surface covered in dust and grime. It was the only thing in the room that seemed untouched by time. The woman stepped toward the mirror, and I followed her, drawn in by some unseen force. As she stood before it, her reflection seemed to waver, flicker, like a flame in the wind. She reached out a hand and touched the glass, her fingers brushing against it gently. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror remained still, its surface as lifeless as it had been before. But then, the reflection shifted. I watched in horror as the woman in the mirror began to change. Her features blurred and twisted, morphing into something darker, something far more sinister. Her face elongated, her eyes growing wide and black, her mouth stretching into a cruel, twisted smile. The reflection was no longer her. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. She stepped back from the mirror, her face pale and stricken with fear. "This is the truth," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is what we became, what we always were. We were never meant to leave." The mirror shimmered once more, and I saw something else, a scene unfolding behind the glass. It was a vision, a memory, a glimpse into the past. I saw people, the inhabitants of Mirabel, standing in front of the very same mirror, their eyes wide with terror. They were reaching out, trying to escape, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break free. The mirror held them in place, trapping them in an eternal moment, frozen in time. And then I saw myself. I stood there in the reflection, my face distorted and twisted, my body a dark silhouette. The mirror was showing me the future, or perhaps the inevitable truth. I was becoming one with this place, just like the others before me. The curse had claimed me, and there was no escape. The woman turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and horror. "You will be trapped here forever," she said softly. "Just like the rest of us, you cannot escape Mirabel." And in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. Mirabel wasn't just a place, it was a prison. A place where time stood still, where the souls of the lost were doomed to wander forever, caught in an endless cycle, never able to break free. The door slammed shut behind me, and I knew that I had become one of them. There was no going back. I was trapped in Mirabel, forever. I stood frozen in front of the mirror, my heart heavy with the realization that it was too late. The truth that the woman had spoken, the truth that had been hidden in the depths of this cursed city, was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I wasn't just lost in Mirabel. I had become part of its story, part of its endless cycle. The air around me grew colder, more oppressive, and the room seemed to grow smaller, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The mirror was no longer just a reflection of the present. It was a window to the past, to the future, to the unending loop that had trapped everyone who had ever come to this forsaken place. I turned away from the mirror, but the figures in the room hadn't moved. They still sat there in the darkness, their eyes locked onto me, watching with a silent, knowing gaze. The woman who had led me here, or had she been leading me to my doom all along, was gone. I was alone now, abandoned in this room, in this nightmare. The house no longer felt like a place of refuge. It was a tomb, a suffocating crypt, a prison. I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways, distant and hollow. But it wasn't the footsteps of someone coming to rescue me. It was the sound of the past, of those who had once been here, who had tried to leave but were consumed by the same curse that had taken me. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling with fear and exhaustion. I had to escape. I couldn't stay here any longer, trapped in this endless night, this place that had no beginning and no end. But as I moved toward the door, I realized with a growing sense of horror that the hallway outside was no longer the same. The door I had entered through was gone. The hallway had changed, shifting like liquid, like it had been rearranged by some unseen force. The walls were now covered in strange symbols, etched into the very stone, as if the house itself was alive, marking its territory. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. There was no escape. I was no longer in the world I had known. I had crossed into another reality, one where time didn't exist, where the past and present merged into one. Suddenly, the room around me started to twist, the edges of the walls bending like they were made of paper. The figures in the room began to stand, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces were still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, always watching, always waiting. "You will never leave," one of them said, its voice distorted and hollow, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You are one of us now, part of the story, part of the city, forever." I turned away, my breath quickening. I had to find a way out, even if it meant confronting the horrors that awaited me. I had to fight. I had to break free. But the longer I stayed in this place, the more I felt the darkness closing in on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. I heard a faint sound, a voice low and guttural, rising from the shadows. "There is no escaping the curse," it whispered. "There is only the end, and the beginning." The walls began to close in, and I felt the pressure on my chest grow stronger. The room was spinning, warping, and everything around me became a blur of shadows and dark shapes. The faces in the shadows twisted and turned, their eyes glowing with a pale, sickly light. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was drowning in this place, sinking into the very darkness that had claimed the city, and soon it would claim me too. But then something changed. I don't know how long I had been standing there, lost in the blackness. But in that moment, I felt a strange clarity. I understood that I wasn't just trapped in Mirabel. I was part of it now. I had crossed the threshold and there was no going back. The city had consumed me, just as it had consumed everyone who had come before me. The mirror was the key, I realized. It had been showing me the truth all along. The truth about this city, about its curse, about the fate of those who entered its walls. The mirror had trapped them, and now it had trapped me. I turned back to face it, my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me anymore. The face in the mirror was twisted, dark and contorted, its eyes wide and empty, staring into the abyss. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingertips brushing the cold surface of the glass. A pulse of energy surged through me, a jolt that left me gasping for air. For a moment I thought I could see the other side, a glimpse of the world I had once known, but it was fleeting, just a brief flicker before everything returned to darkness. And then, everything stopped. The room went silent. The figures in the shadows disappeared, the air cleared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. But it was too late. The curse had already done its work. The city of Mirabel had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. I was no longer just a visitor, a wanderer. I was part of its dark history, part of its endless night. As I stood there staring into the mirror, I realized with a final terrifying clarity, I wasn't going anywhere. I was one of them now, one of the lost souls trapped in the city's eternal grasp, and the cycle would continue, forever. The end was the beginning was the end, and Mirabel would never let go. Thank you for watching, and if you like strange and exciting stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the alert bell to get everything that is out of the ordinary. If you have experiences or opinions, share them with us in the comments. Always be ready for the unexpected and buy in the next story if you dare to hear it.